Okay, welcome back. So everything that we've talked about so far has been quite optimistic when it comes to virtual reality. But not everybody necessarily shares that same vision. People have said it's a gimmick. They say it's limited to just being a gaming system. People have said it's even overhyped. So in this video, we're going to talk about whether the optimistic vision, our vision, is true, or whether VR just won't make it to the level of the next major technology. And I want to do it through the lens of history by comparing it to some other of our favorite technologies. So let's get into the slides and go through exactly that. All right, so let's talk about history. So remember when PCs were invented? They were really expensive. The first one from IBM and Apple, they were the equivalent of over $5,000 after you adjusted for inflation. And that wasn't accessible to the average person at that time. What else? They took up a lot of space. You had these big desktops, these giant heavy monitors, a bunch of accessories, and a lot of wiring. You needed a desk to basically hold all this as well. What else? When they first came out, they weren't all that useful. You couldn't do much beyond, say, playing games and some of the basic functions like word processing, spreadsheets, and things like that. They weren't connected. So the internet at that time didn't really become big until long after the PC first came to market. And then from a business standpoint, they weren't overly profitable. For a few companies, they might have been, but it wasn't this mass industry like it is today. It took a lot of money to start and to run a computer business, and since the market was so small, it was hard to profit. So if you were to summarize everything, they were too big. They didn't really do much beyond the initial novelty, couldn't connect with others, and were too expensive. So it seemed overhyped because why would any business go into a market that didn't have much going for it? Now we know what the PC eventually became, but this is what they were at first. Okay, let's do another example. So do you remember when the internet first came about? So at that time, what was it like? Well, it was slow. Remember those dial-up speeds and getting booted offline? It was quite frustrating to do even the most basic of things. It lacked good infrastructure, so you had to use phone lines, and many buildings or homes just weren't wired properly. Bandwidth was an issue. Overall, we just didn't have the technology at the time to really do much on the internet, in the early days at least. What else? It didn't have much use. You could go into chat rooms, you could send emails, you could look up basic information in encyclopedias, but for the most part, when the internet first came about, the initial versions were nothing special at all. And of course, we all remember that it got tons of investment and hype, but it yielded very little initial profitability. Now, some companies did great, things like Yahoo, Amazon, they were really, really good. But remember how quickly that the dot-com bubble came about because companies were getting valued highly with no real business plan, no real profitability. A lot of those companies ended up failing. So even though the internet was cool in the early days, it wasn't that great when we look back on it. Even someone like Bill Gates was rumored to have said there's little use in consumer internet. Now this was a long time ago, but regardless, he was rumored to have said that. Few predicted what it would eventually become. All right, one more example. So remember when mobile phones became big? So the first versions, they were big and heavy. The first versions were barely mobile and really couldn't even fit into your pockets. They dropped tons of calls. Remember those commercials, "Can you hear me now?" It was extremely unreliable for many years after the first mobile came out. The phones themselves had no features beyond just simple calling. Eventually, texting came about, but for a while it was just calling and texting, and that was it. The initial ones required ridiculous contracts with all the carriers. It was really expensive and pretty long-term commitment at the time. And then even when the first smartphones came out, they were very limited in what they did. You could play different games, you could use their organization features, and eventually you could connect to a really crappy browser. But it took many years until the iPhone really came out that modernized smartphones as we know them today. Okay, so why are we talking about these other technologies? Well, let's talk about virtual reality today. So we believe that VR is a revolutionary technology, but there's a few caveats to that. So the hardware is too big, and since it's a wearable technology where you put it on your head, it's uncomfortable when it rests on that head. It's heavy, and dealing with all those wires that are sticking out of it. What else? they have technical limitations compared to their potential. So people talk about graphics constraints, motion constraints, hard drive and memory constraints, connectivity constraints, and many more. Right now, there's not a whole lot of use for it except for gaming and basic applications. Basically, they say it's just a novelty and it doesn't have long-term use potential. And the other big critique is that they're too expensive. So the headsets themselves are expensive, but some of them also require either a high-performing computer or a high-performing mobile phone to work. Now, all of these things are true. The first version of VR is all of these things, but they're almost the exact same complaints that people had about PCs, the internet, and mobile phones when they first came out. VR is definitely a revolutionary technology. It's just not quite there today. Now, it does things we could only dream of doing. It changes everything. And in the first version, there's inevitably going to be things that will get a lot better with time. Technology will improve. More people will invest in fixing all the issues. And as more people buy the headsets, the money is then there to develop revolutionary software and VR experiences. Once it takes off, like when the iPhone came to market for mobiles, it takes off very quickly. And some amazing things are going to happen at that time. So we urge you to learn from history. VR is definitely not perfect today, but if you fall into similar traps that you would have in those other technologies, you're missing the opportunity of your generation. So let's move on and let's talk about the timeline for when VR is likely to become that amazing technology.